They told you Japan was the model. They told you it was the future. They told you it had beaten America. They lied. Right now, we look at Japan and we see an amazing country, beautiful culture, incredible technology, high quality of life. But for 30 years, Japan has been locked in an economic cage. A single fatal mistake, a financial bubble that burst, didn't just slow them down. It doomed the world's most promising economy to a nightmare of stagnation. 3 decades. That is longer than most of you watching this have been alive. This is the real terrifying story of how one of the most powerful countries on earth simply stopped growing, and why it's a crisis that should scare everyone in every developed nation today. If you were alive in the 1980s, the only nation anyone talked about with fear and awe was Japan. Forget America. Forget Germany. Japan was the unstoppable economic machine. Just 40 years after being absolutely crushed in World War II, Japan had rebuilt itself with a focus so intense and a quality so high that they were putting American companies out of business. They invented concepts like lean manufacturing and just-in-time inventory. They were building cars that lasted forever and electronics that were a decade ahead of everyone else. Think of Sony, Toyota, Nintendo, and Honda. They weren't just companies. They were symbols of absolute global domination. The Japanese miracle wasn't just a miracle. It was a phenomenon. They had achieved something no country had ever done before. They went from total defeat to a global economic superpower in a single generation. By 1988, their economy was booming so hard that American politicians and business leaders were panicking. Newsweek magazine even ran a cover story asking, "Is Japan buying America?" The fear was real, the success was undeniable, and the feeling was that Japan was destined to become the #1 economy in the world, leaving the United States in the dust. But that success, that confidence, that sense of destiny, it created something dangerous. It created a feeling of absolute immunity. The Japanese people and their leaders started to believe that their rules, their systems, their economy, everything was different. They believed they were simply too smart, too hardworking, and too powerful to fail. And that, right there, is the moment the fatal seed of their coming collapse was planted. How did a country as disciplined and focused as Japan create one of the biggest, most insane financial bubbles in history? It started with a belief, a national myth, about the value of land. Japan is a tiny, mountainous country, and only a small fraction of its land is actually usable or livable. This natural scarcity was the perfect fuel for a speculative fire. People started to believe that the price of Japanese land could only ever go up. It was a guaranteed investment. This wasn't just a hope. It became a core national belief. If you own land, you are rich. If you don't, you are losing out. This concept drove everyone from massive corporations to small families to pour all their money into real estate. Now, let's talk numbers, because this is where the story becomes truly unbelievable. By 1989, the value of the land in Japan was estimated to be 4 times the total value of all the land in the United States. Think about that for a second. A country about the size of California had land that was collectively worth 4 times all the land across the entire American continent. Let us be specific. The land under the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo, a relatively small piece of property, was said to be worth more than all the land in the entire state of California. It's a statement that seems ridiculous on the surface, but it gives you a sense of the sheer, impossible scale of this bubble. This land boom drove the stock market wild, too. Companies that owned vast tracts of land saw their stock prices go straight up because their balance sheets looked incredible. People were rushing to buy stocks, not because of what the companies were producing, but because of the property they owned. The main stock index in Japan, the Nikkei 225, went from about 13,000 points in 1985 to nearly 39,000 points in December 1989. This threefold increase in just 4 years was powered by sheer collective delusion. So you had a feedback loop. Land prices rise because people believe they will always rise. Companies leveraged this incredibly valuable land to take out massive bank loans. They used those loans to buy more land or invest in the stock market. The stock market rises. This rising stock value gives the companies more confidence, and the banks are happy because their loan collateral, the land and the stocks, is getting more valuable every day. It looked perfect. It looked like a machine that could never break. The wealth was intoxicating and everyone was getting rich. But every machine has a breaking point, and for Japan, it was one small, seemingly innocent policy decision. The man who eventually burst the bubble didn't mean to. He was simply trying to restore sanity. In the late 1980s, the Japanese economy, fueled by cheap credit and asset bubbles, was showing signs of extreme overheating. Housing was unaffordable, stocks were detached from reality, and inflation was starting to creep up. The Bank of Japan, the country's central bank, looked at this situation and decided it had to act like any responsible central bank. It had to raise interest rates to cool things down. From 1989 to 1990, the Bank of Japan raised its interest rate 5 times, moving the rate from a tiny 2.5% up to 6%. This was a crucial, fatal turning point. Why was this such a big deal? Because the entire bubble was built on easy, cheap money. People and companies took out massive loans assuming the interest rate would stay low forever. When the rate went up, the cost of servicing that debt, the cost of simply paying the interest on the loan, skyrocketed. This meant 2 things. It became much more expensive to borrow new money to buy more land or stocks. The speculators had to stop speculating. The people who already had huge loans suddenly had much less cash flow. They had to start selling assets, stocks, and land just to cover the interest payments. When a few people start selling, the prices start to dip. When prices dip, the collective belief that prices only go up is shattered. And when that belief dies, the panic begins. The collapse. 1990, the year everything died. The year 1990 was the point of no return. It was the moment of complete, unrecoverable financial crisis. On the very first trading day of the new year, 1990, the stock market fell. It was a small dip, but it was the start of an avalanche. Throughout 1990, the Nikkei index collapsed, losing over 40% of its value. The stock market bubble had officially burst. But the real, long-term doom came from the land. Land prices peaked a little later, around 1991, but once they started falling, they never stopped. Imagine you bought a piece of land in Tokyo in 1989 for 100 million yen. By 1995, it might be worth 50 million. By 2005, maybe 20 million. And by 2010, maybe only 10 million yen. Prices fell for decades. They lost 80% of their peak value and never ever recovered. This massive, sustained fall in asset prices is known as the balance sheet recession. This is a term you need to understand because it's the key to Japan's lost decades. When prices fell, the banks and corporations realized their entire system was a lie. All those loans the banks had given out to buy land and stocks were now backed by worthless collateral. A corporation that borrowed 100 million yen was supposed to pay it back. But if the land they used as collateral was now only worth 20 million yen, the bank was never getting its money back. These loans became what are known as non-performing loans, NPLs. The entire banking system was infected. It wasn't just a few banks. It was every major bank, and the amount of bad debt was staggering hundreds of billions of dollars. The economy was poisoned, and the immediate, crippling effect was that the banks, terrified of going bankrupt themselves, completely stopped lending money. This is the sound of an economy choking to death. No lending, no investment, no growth. So the economy was doomed by a burst bubble. But what turned a bad recession into 3 decades of stagnation? The answer is simple: denial and delay. The Japanese government and its central bank made a second, even more fatal mistake. They refused to admit the scale of the crisis and clean up the mess. They followed a strategy of delay and pray. They delayed mandatory, painful cleanup, and they prayed that the economy would somehow recover on its own. The central issue was the banks. They were technically bankrupt, holding massive amounts of bad loans. But the government was terrified of letting them fail, fearing a complete economic collapse that would shake the entire world. Instead of forcing the banks to declare the bad loans, sell the bad assets, and recapitalize, get new, healthy money, the government allowed them to keep operating, supported by quiet government funds. These were the zombie banks. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They spent all their effort simply surviving and trying to hide the bad debt, rather than doing what banks are supposed to do, lending money to new, productive businesses. For over a decade, these zombie banks continued to lend money primarily to zombie companies, old, inefficient businesses that should have failed, but were kept alive only because they employed people and the banks were too afraid to pull the plug and admit the loan was a loss. This process is called evergreening loans. The consequence was fatal for Japan's future. No creative destruction, new. Innovative startups couldn't get loans because the banks were risk-averse and focused on keeping old companies afloat. Low productivity. Capital and labor were stuck in inefficient, dying companies instead of flowing to new, high-growth sectors. The economy was trapped in amber. This denial lasted for over 10 long years, paralyzing the financial system. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the government finally got serious about cleaning up the banks, but by then, the damage was irreversible. A decade of zero growth had permanently changed the psyche of the nation. The long-term legacy of the bubble's collapse wasn't just financial. It was psychological and demographic. Imagine you are a young person graduating high school or university in 1993, when your parents were your age and could get a job for life at a major corporation, buy a house that was guaranteed to increase in value, and enjoy constant salary increases. But when you graduate, you face a labor market where no one is hiring. The zombie companies aren't hiring because they're barely alive. The healthy companies are so paranoid and scarred by the crisis that they refuse to invest in the future. This created Japan's lost generation. Millions of highly skilled young people were forced into low-wage, temporary, or part-time work. They could not save money, they could not start families, and they could not afford the homes their parents owned. The sense of guaranteed progress was dead. This is the great national tragedy of Japan's lost decades. Deflation and saving. Prices started falling, deflation. Which sounds nice, but it's an economic doomsday scenario. Why? If you know a TV will cost 5% less next year, you hold off buying it this year. If everyone holds off, the economy grinds to a halt. People became obsessed with saving, not spending, because they feared the next economic downturn. This saving mentality killed demand. Demographic crisis. Because of the lack of good jobs and a secure future, young people delayed marriage and having children. This accelerated Japan's long-term decline in birth rates. Today, Japan has one of the oldest and fastest shrinking populations in the world, an existential crisis that directly traces its roots back to the burst bubble and the subsequent job market paralysis. It's a self-inflicted wound, compounded by political inaction. Japan is now trapped in a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. Low growth leads to low wages. Low wages lead to low spending. Low spending leads to deflation. Deflation makes people save even more. And the aging population means there are fewer young workers to power the economy. They are in a low-growth trap that they simply cannot escape. The story of Japan's lost decades is not just history. It is a vital, urgent lesson for every country today. What really happens when an economic bubble bursts? It's not the initial crash. That is just noise. The real fatal threat is the slow, agonizing process of denial. Japan's ultimate mistake wasn't the speculative mania bubbles happen everywhere. Their mistake was failing to use the crisis moment to force a painful but necessary restructuring. They chose to protect the status quo, to keep the old, dying companies and banks on life support, hoping the good times would magically return. This political and institutional paralysis is what doomed a generation and crippled a world-leading economy for 30 years. Whenever you hear about soaring housing prices or a stock market that doesn't seem to make sense, or governments delaying tough decisions on bad debt, you need to remember the Japanese example. The longer you put off cleaning up the mess, the higher the ultimate long-term price will be. The price Japan paid was not measured in dollars, but in decades of lost opportunity, lost hope, and a permanently altered future. It's a terrifying lesson in economics, and perhaps an even scarier one in human nature. If you want to understand how other economic superpowers deal with crisis, make sure you subscribe.